All right. So hey all, my name is Paul Ruiz. I'm a developer relations engineer with the Android Enterprise team. So today we're going to talk about how you can authenticate your users using non-Google identity providers. Though honestly, another name for this talk could have just been, please stop using WebViews for authentication. So I know it's come up a bit over the last few years, but while a lot of people know that they should use custom tabs for authentication, we definitely could have been more clear on how to implement some of the best practices, since we just haven't really seen the adoption that we were expecting. So to add to this, we're actually going to make an announcement tomorrow that we are going to be deprecating WebView specifically for authentication. Just authentication, not like across the board yet. So the idea behind this is that it's going to deal with some of the security concerns inherent with WebView, and will help pave the way for support around single sign-on and some signal gathering. So to help with that transition, I have a few things that I'm going to cover today. First, I'll briefly talk about an OAuth 2 flow for native apps, so everyone is just kind of on the same page before we dive into some code. Secondly, I'm going to set up a third-party identity provider with a specific user account. So the main reason I wanted to go this route is that Google has this not always super helpful habit of always using their own services for tutorials, documentation, code labs, and pretty much everything else. But only a handful of our enterprises are actually using Google Sign-In for all of their products. So I wanted to pick a third party just to show a more universal and hopefully useful example. And then finally, I'm going to go over how you can use the AppAuth library to actually implement authentication and authorization with those third-party identity providers for your apps. Great. So there's roughly two camps that we hear from when it comes to authentication. So the first is that authentication is difficult, with some even saying that it's almost as bad as working with time zones, which I'm sure some of you know is just really bad. The other group that we hear from doesn't exactly paint a great picture either. So those that understand how authentication systems work still know that it's not always intuitive or seamless. So unfortunately, in the time that we have today, I'm not going to be able to come up here and tell you that I have an answer for all of your authentication problems. What I can do is try to explain some of the non-intuitive aspects with an example for a pretty standard use case. This way, authentication will at least move from being an obnoxious problem to something that you can figure out with some of the background knowledge that you pick up today. So there's 4 types of auth flows outlined in the specification doc for OAuth 2. These are authorization code, implicit grant, resource owner password credentials, and client credentials. So to keep things simple today, I'm just going to work with the authorization code grant type, since it's one of the more common for native apps, and it kind of fits perfectly with the way the AppAuth library is set up. So let's actually go over how this authentication flow is going to work. So there are 4 key components to the code grant type flow: your native app, an authorization and token endpoints, and then those are actually going to come from your identity provider, and then the web API backend. Starting from your native app, you'll want to open a custom tab to the authorization endpoint. So that page is going to have a way for your user to actually provide a username and a password so that they can log in with the identity provider. Once the user is authenticated, an authorization code is going to be returned back to your app, and then you can send that authorization code along with a client ID, potentially a client secret, and any other necessary information to the token endpoint. And then if everything matches up correctly with what the identity provider was expecting, it'll return an access token and a refresh token back to your native app. You can then put that access token in a authorization header for any API calls that you make to your, from your client to your backend. And then using that received token, your web API can kind of do some magic behind the scenes to confirm that the token is valid and that's matching up to a specific user. Then it can decide what information they should have access to. It'll wrap up by then sending any of that valid data that they've figured out the user should have back to the user and the client. Once you get to this point, you'll generally just kind of end up repeating this process for as long as the access token is still valid. And then that said, after a while, you should expect that token to expire. That way, the same token can't just be continuously used by either the authorized user or somebody unexpected. So when this happens, assuming that you have the refresh token, you can just hit the token endpoint again with your refresh token, client ID, and basically anything else that the provider is expecting. And then this will end up returning updated access and refresh tokens. So with those 2 new tokens stored up in your app again, you can just continue making calls to your web API until it's time to repeat this whole refresh process all over again. Cool. So now that we have kind of a general idea of the authorization code flow for OAuth 2, let's actually take a minute to set up a third-party identity provider. So for this talk, I'm just going to use Ping Identity as my provider. So this is mainly because they're one of our partners, so we've kind of already vetted that they're using best practices on their end. Their documentation just made it really easy for me to set this up with AppAuth, which I'm a huge fan of. And a little bit more on a personal note, they're actually based out of my hometown in Colorado, so it kind of gives them extra points for me. But if you have another provider that you prefer to use, so Okta, Microsoft, Auth0, whoever, this should all be relatively applicable to you. The UI is going to be a little bit different, just depending on who you're using, but the general flow should work the same. So first and foremost, we are going to need to set up our identity provider for the authorization code flow. For simplicity, I'm actually not going to turn on client secrets here for this provider, but if your use case is different and you require that, go ahead and do that. I'm going to discuss how the secret works later on, since it's still like one line change, but it's not required for like this actual thing if you come back to the video to review this. We're also going to want to include a couple of redirect URLs that will be used after we've authenticated user, as well as after we've signed them out. So one thing that's worth noting here is that the schema that I use here is AppAuth, but in practice, you'd actually want to do something that's a bit more unique to prevent any sort of conflict with other apps that might be installed on the user's device. If you're a little bit more interested in like why this is that way and how that works, there was a talk in 2016 from the Android for Work conference. It's up on YouTube. You'd be able to find that, but that'll have like a lot more background into why you set it up this way. Or rather, not set it up this way. So once everything's configured, you can actually check the URLs that are given to us by the identity provider. And then for this talk, the most important URLs are going to be the authorization and the token endpoints. You'll probably notice that these are actually two of the pillars that we had discussed when we went over the OAuth 2 flow as well. So we're going to want to use the sign-off endpoint as well whenever the user is ready to actually end their session. And then finally, we're just going to want to add a user profile that the user can log into with their username and password. Depending on who your provider is, you might have different ways to do this. I just went ahead and used their like UI to set this up. And then generally, if you're with an enterprise, you tend to have like an IT admin who would do this for you as well. So I wouldn't worry too much about this. It's just a way to basically put an account on there that you can have somebody log in with. So with all that out of the way, we can actually start digging into the main content for this talk. So through the rest of this presentation, I'm going to actually go over how you can use the AppAuth library for Android to follow all the best practices that have been laid out for authentication and authorization using custom tabs, without actually having to go through and write it all from the ground up. So that said, a full-fledged app is going to take a lot longer to cover than we just really have time for today. So there are going to be a few caveats that we should kind of discuss. This is going to be a single activity app, so nothing too fancy. It's not going to have any of the real architecture behind it, like view models, lifecycle management, unidirectional data flow, or really any of the good stuff that kind of makes up modern Android development that we've grown to at least like. I'm also going to use regular view binding for the UI instead of Compose, because Compose is still relatively new, and it's just not really the focal point for this talk. Finally, there is going to be a lot of code for the rest of this talk. So this is being recorded, so if you want to go back and actually just pause on whatever slide and kind of go through it, that'll work if you care enough. Otherwise, I'll also have the slides available online. You can just kind of find me, and I'll send them over. To get started, I'm just going to kind of assume that this is our base app. So right now, it's just going to be a single button with a few other hidden UI elements that'll pop up once we've finished authenticating. Overall, the UI is going to stay relatively simple. It's kind of the theme of this app. It's more about AppAuth than anything else. And then moving on to our dependencies, there are a small set that we'll need to make sure that we import for the sample project. So the first one's pretty obvious. This is a talk about AppAuth and that library. So you will need to import the AppAuth library into your projects. And then I'm also going to bring in this JSON Web Token decoder library from Auth0. I actually just learned this is called JOT when you call it GWT the other day, and I hate that name. So I'm going to just like say the full thing out. But anyway, so in a few slides, though, I'm going to get into why we need it and how it's going to be helpful for us. But for now, just trust me, it'll actually make our lives a bit easier. And then I'm going to just bring in OKHTTP for networking, Picasso for image loading, and coroutines for handling some asynchronous operations. These specific libraries aren't super necessary, since you probably have your own preferences or requirements within your apps. They're just a means to an end. If you have something else that'll work for you, go ahead and use it. But yeah. And then after bringing in the dependencies, we're going to need to add a new activity node to the Android manifest file, specifically for this redirect URI receiver activity class, which is built into the AppAuth library. This one's a little funny because it both exists as a workaround for custom tabs not being directly closable programmatically, as well as a way to accept the redirect portion for our OAuth flow. This activity is actually going to redirect back to our app with any available data while removing the custom tab off of the backstack once the user has finished their actions with our identity provider. And then one of the big things to notice in this area, too, is that we've included a data node that uses a scheme and a host, plus an optional path, so that this activity knows what URIs are going to need to be redirected. We'll also need to add a second intent filter for this example to handle redirecting logout responses. Additionally, it's kind of important to note that these values should match up to the redirect URIs that were set up with the identity provider a few slides ago. And then to wrap up our work with the Android manifest file, we'll just need to add a new intent filter to our auth activity to help with routing. So in this case, it's just going to be our main activity. And then once we're done with the manifest, it's time to actually jump over to our main code. So there's a few URLs from our identity provider that we're going to want to save. In our case, they're just going to save them as strings in a constant file. You may want to do something better in real life, just because you may want to update them remotely or what have you. But for this sample, it kind of works out. You might also recognize these URLs from a few slides ago when I set up the identity provider. So where these URLs come from is going to depend on the identity provider that you're using, but what exists should be relatively standardized. We'll also need to save our client ID, our redirect URLs, and for this example, we'll save an API URL that we'll call once the authentication is complete. So it's kind of a lot of setup and boilerplate. I'm sorry. But we're almost ready to get to the actual core of this app and then what will actually work with our auth flow. So while we would want to restore our app's auth state at the startup, if the user were coming back after they've already authenticated and authorized and all that good stuff, I'm just going to kind of hand wave that away for now. And we'll also ignore this init view here, since it's really just going to handle view binding and setting up how everything looks from our simple version of the app. So where things are going to get a little bit more interesting is when we get into these two functions. So the first function is where we set up the authorization service configuration object, which for this example is an object that we're just storing at the top of main activity. This is where we're going to bind our authorization URL, token, and logout URLs with our auth library. Moving from there, we're going to need to initialize our authorization service. This object is going to be used for making our calls over to our identity provider. And then one extra thing that's kind of worth noting here, too, is that I added a browser matcher that only allows authentication to happen using a Chrome custom tab or a Samsung custom tab through an additional app auth configuration object. You actually have a few options available here, too, but I just wanted to highlight that you do have some flexibility for whatever you decide to support for your use cases. Another thing that's worth noting here, too, is that this is an app auth configuration object, so it shouldn't be confused with the authorization service configuration object on the last slide. And with all the setup done, it's time to make our actual request for an authorization code. This is typically what you would just kind of have behind a login button within your app, though, if anyone's kind of curious where you would kick this off. So we'll start by creating an authorization builder that accepts the auth service config that contains our auth URL, a client ID, the response type that we're expecting to be returned, so in this case, it's code, and the redirect URI that will be used when our authorization code is returned. Then, while it's not necessary for this example, we're also going to set some scopes just so that you can see how they're added in case they're required for your cases. Finally, we'll create a hash map for any additional parameters that we want to include within our initial authorization request. Again, not being used really for this example, but it's kind of something I wanted to show in case you do need it. And then once we have the request builder configured, we can simply create the new request object, use that to create an authorization request intent through our authorization service, and then launch it using an authorization launcher that we're going to define here soon. So at this point, your app should just launch a new custom tab window that kind of redirects to your identity provider's auth URL. This is where your provider is going to check for usernames, passwords, and basically handling and making sure that everything is correct on their end before they return that authorization code to your app. Something that I kind of like about this, too, is that generally they're going to handle password resets and all that kind of stuff. If your users are like me and they just forget their password way too much and more than they should admit, rather than you having to build that directly into your apps. And then once the user is authenticated, the identity provider should return a URL that's going to look like this to your app. You can see the URL follows the format that we declared in our Android manifest file here. So this is actually how the user's device is going to know how to forward this URL back to your app. And at the end of the URL is going to be the code that we'll use to retrieve our token, as well as the state values that we're going to use for, as you can probably guess, tracking the user's authorization state. And then when this URL gets sent back to our app, it should end up being handled by a launcher that's listening for the activity result. This is the same launcher that we used a few slides ago to launch the request intent. So assuming the result is OK, we'll simply pass the intent from the response off to another function, which in this case is just going to be named handle authorization response. And then once we get into the handle authorization response function, we're going to create a new authorization response object from the passed intent, check for any errors, and then save an auth state object based on the state value in our response, assuming that this is the first solid reference that we've actually received. Now, if everything has gone correctly up until this point, which hopefully it has, you just never know, auth is kind of, it's wanky, then we're going to need to exchange the authorization code that we just received for an auth token. And then we can start by creating a token exchange request based off of the initial authorization response. From there, we can perform the token request using our authorization service while passing in a token response callback to the function. One thing that's actually worth noting here, too, is that if you have set up your provider to expect a client secret, we talked about a little bit ago, then you just create a new client secret basic object and then pass in the authorization service when you're performing that same token request. That said, it's really important that you do not save your client secret locally as a hard-coded string because, you know, it's a secret. And you don't want anyone with malintent just kind of getting it from your app. So I did it here for this example just to simplify things. Don't do that. To get around this problem, there's a few options you have and how you would like properly handle it. It's kind of outside the scope of this talk, but just be aware, bad. Great, so if everything has turned out well, then you should receive a response similar to this one. The really important pieces of data in this response, at least for our case, include the access token and the ID token, which we're going to use over the next few slides. When that token response is returned, it'll get handled by the callback that we just associated with the request. At that point, we'll actually want to check to see if there was an exception in our authorization request, and then if there was, we're going to save a new blank auth state object just so the app knows that the user didn't actually successfully authenticate, so we can kind of figure out what we want to do to handle that case. And then if everything looks good at this point, we're going to update our auth state using the new response, extract the access and ID tokens, and then I'm going to use that auth0 library that we imported earlier to create a JSON web token based off of that ID token. This is actually kind of something that I thought was just kind of fun when I was learning about auth not too long ago. So this really long string is what our ID token is going to look like when it's returned to us. But once we decode it into a JSON web token, we get a string that looks like this. For our use case, we're only going to want to extract the email, given name, family name, and picture to display within our app. And once we have that information, we can simply load the strings for the name and email into the proper views, and then use the profile URL to load the image. So in this case, I'm just using Picasso to load it because it's simple and it does exactly what I need. Again, if you're using like Glide or something else, feel free to use it. Just kind of a means to an end. So once all that's done, you can just see the profile information for our authenticated user in our little working Android app. And since we'll have our authorization token ready to go at this point, we can actually start thinking about making API calls over to our backend. So one thing that's great about the AppAuth library is that it actually has this perform action with fresh tokens call. When you use that, the library is actually going to automatically handle refreshing your tokens if it's necessary when you're making your API call. So you don't need to like put that logic in your app other than using this one call. And then once the token is confirmed good, or it's refreshed without any exceptions happening, then you can perform your API calls with from a non-UI thread. And then as far as how you perform that API call is going to be up to you. Again, this is kind of an example. Just make sure you actually have that authorization header and the bearer token in your request. And then finally, once the user is done with our app and they're ready to just log out, we can create a new end session request using the user's ID token, as well as a redirect URL that's going to be used specifically for handling the case that the user is logging out. So with all that put together, we'll just go ahead and launch our end session request intent that's created through the authorization service. And then that redirect URI will get caught just like our initial authorization redirect, and then handled accordingly. When it's time to close the app, the final step is going to be unregistering the launchers that were used for this for the two redirects. And then with all of that done, you're pretty much set with a basic auth example using the AppAuth library and a third-party identity provider. Yeah, that's it. There's my email. There's my Twitter if anyone wants to get a hold of me. Oh, thank you.